Hello there, and a huge welcome to today's episode of Gina Gardiner and Friends. Today, I'm joined by a group of amazing people who all work within the care system, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. So let's start with Sarah Thomas. Sarah, please share with our audience who you are and what you get up to.
Hi, Gina. I'm Sarah Thomas. I'm the Chief Executive of the Foster Network. We're the largest fostering charity in the UK, and we work across the UK, so in each of the different nations. And our primary goal is to improve fostering, to improve it so that it can be the best that it can be for children and young people that live in foster care.
Thank you very much. Sophia, let's go to you next.
Hi, Gina. My name's Sophia Alexandra Hall. I'm actually a full-time journalist. I'm the deputy digital editor at The Big Issue, but maybe more importantly, I'm a care experienced person myself.
Thank you very much for joining us. And next, Geoff.
Hi, Gina. I'm Geoff Durbin, and in terms of today, very relevant from a foster carer point of view. Previously, myself and my wife were short-term foster carers and are currently Mockingbird Hub Carers. I also am one of two foster carers who sit on the DfE's Foster Advisory Board and a board member of two other wonderful charities working in this sector, Together Trust, I'm sure you know well, and Great Minds Together.
Thank you. Before we move on to Terry, what's the Mockingbird Hub?
So Mockingbird is an evidence-based extended family model, which is now being rolled out nationally. Stockport, where myself and my wife foster, or one of the places it started first. And effectively, if you can imagine a wider what's called a constellation of families, so 8 fostering families with a hub carer in the middle, and we provide peer-to-peer support for the foster carers and of course the children themselves. So you would have regular meetings, but also individual situations. Children can come and stay at our house, and obviously it's very much a trauma-informed therapeutic model, and it's one that's working.
It reminds me really of an extended family, that it gives youngsters and foster carers that support in a different way. I'm going to come back to that later on in the recording. Terry, last but not least, please introduce yourself and what you get up to.
Yeah, my name's Terry Galloway. So I'm care experienced myself. I founded or co-founded the Care Leaver Local Offer, which is a website that compares local authorities for what they do for children leaving the care system. I also run a housing association, Housing Care Leavers, and also I'm leading the campaign to make care experience a protected characteristic in UK legislation.
What do you mean by protected characteristic?
So under the Equality Act 2010, there's already 9 protected characteristics such as race, pregnancy, sex, disabilities. So what that basically means is whenever a decision or a service is designed by a public authority, they have to do what's known as an equality impact assessment to see how that decision or that service is going to impact those with protected characteristics. So what we're saying is that when they design services, they should be thinking how those services impact care experienced people.
That's really helpful. Thank you for the explanation. We're going to be talking about the care system and particularly foster care today. Sarah, in your role, what is your view of the state of foster care in the UK? And although our audience is global, let's just focus for the moment in the UK.
Yeah, so there's a couple of key stats, I suppose, that set this out, and that is that we've got over 100,000 children who are looked after at the moment in the UK. So that's over 100,000 children and young people who are removed from their families and deemed to be looked after under the Children Act that exists in our country. So alongside that is increasing demand on fostering families, and the provision of fostering has become quite difficult over the last few years because the numbers of children becoming looked after goes up and the number of foster carers has gone down, and year on year we have less net gain in foster carers. So We need to work harder to ensure that we raise awareness of fostering in society and to ensure that foster carers feel respected and are able to come forward, that more people are able to come forward and become fostering families for the increasing numbers of children that are becoming looked after. But we also need to do something about those increasing numbers. And I think improved prevention is really critical at the moment. You know, that what support are we able to provide to families? And one of the reasons that preventative work has been there's less provision around that is because of the squeeze on budgets, the financial issues that we are experiencing as a country as a whole, but because of the greater cost of providing care, like foster care or residential care. It's preventing local authorities and those other service providers from being able to put as much funds into that preventative end. So, and the problem is that you can't solve the issues that we're experiencing without putting funding into both parts. But really important that we start thinking about how we can improve prevention and how we can do that in a creative way.
It seems to be a bit of a paradox, really, that we've got more youngsters being taken into care. And my understanding is that local authorities, particularly in England, are reporting that local authorities are taking more children into care as months go by. Do you think that there is a link between that and the fact that there's growing levels of poverty within the UK?
Yeah, I would say that there is. I imagine that would get quite a bit of attention if people were doing more research into that, and if we could have some evidence to support that. You know, children become looked after for many different reasons, and the thresholds in our country for that are very clear. They're defined in legislation, and it is about, you know, demonstrating that a child is at risk of harm or has been harmed. And I think that we need to be cautious about making assumptions about that broader population, really, and what might be behind those increasing numbers or not.
Okay, I think that's a very good point. Thank you ever so much. Now, we have care experienced people within this panel. Do you think things have fundamentally changed since you were in care? And what were the issues that you faced in care that you think are still a problem? Sophia, can we start with you?
Yeah, of course. So I'm 27, so I've been out of foster care for 9 years, and I haven't been officially a care leaver for 4 or 6. But even in the short time that I've left the care system, I can see the changes. And honestly, like every day I see these changes and it makes me really emotional. For me, it was always stigma. So, you know, like growing up, and actually the reason I became a journalist, I used to see headlines like all these problem kids going into these care homes, or care homes being protested against, which unfortunately we still see. Or, you know, in TV shows, there'd be a villain and you'd find out halfway through the TV show he's care experienced and that's why he's a serial killer. And it was all these kind of, you know, like stereotypes and stigma that really kind of affected sort of my experience in care. But these days we have so many role models, like visible role models, I think is the important thing to say here. People like Lem Sisse, Sophie Willand's new series of Alma's Not Normal launches at the time of this recording. We've got people like Terry Galloway, who is very famous within our community. We've got journalists like Ashley John Baptiste. I can name lots of people who are very visibly care experienced, and I didn't see that growing up, so much so that actually when I went into foster care, I was a teenager. And as a teenager, the only way I could kind of think about how do I adapt to this new normal was, oh, I'll go on YouTube and see if anyone's vlogging about their experience in care. And I came across a lot of foster parents doing it, but I didn't see anyone who was me, a teenager in care, doing it. But now, you know, I know lots of young people who talk about their experiences, and it just really warms my heart. We have things like the Christmas Dinner Project, which, you know, Lem Sisse hosts Christmas dinners across the country, or his project started various Christmas dinners across the country. So, you know, care leavers aren't spending Christmas alone. That was a big thing for me. I've spent multiple Christmases alone. And then sort of wider societal changes as well. It's like I can walk into a card shop near Father's Day and find cards addressed to foster dad, or like person who is like a dad. And it's these small little changes that it makes me really emotional, and we are heading in the right direction. But as Sarah says, like, there just isn't enough, in my opinion, funding going into the care system right now. We've had 14 years of austerity, which you can choose whether or not you want to correlate the increased figures of people going into care with the last 14 years of austerity. As someone who writes The Big Issue, you can imagine what my thoughts are. But recently, 2 years ago now, we had the publication of the independent review into children's social care, and there was a suggested amount for how much it would take to fix the care system, and that is not a suggested amount that has been met or promised by, in any shape or form, by the government.
My sense check is that whilst money is hugely important and having the resources, certainly in my short experience working with Fatima in terms of her campaign, is that we as a society having high expectations for ourselves in terms of how we help and support young people who through no fault of their own find themselves in care, and how we should have high aspirations for them and do everything we can to make sure that they can reach their potential. And my sense check very definitely is that that's not happening at the moment. So thank you. Geoff, what's your view?
Well, you've mentioned a few things. What do you want me to start on, Gina?
Well, from your perspective as a care experience, what is your view of where we are now and what you think needs to be done moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, my experience of care is secondhand. It's through the children that we look after. So, I think I never pretend to fully understand that experience. It's not the same when you haven't gone through it. And also not pretend to represent all foster carers. One of the things about foster carers is the differences with experience, with the challenge, with the different types of situations is absolutely huge. I can give you my feelings and my thoughts, but I think foster carers are very passionate about that, and we've been fostering for 10 years. I look at foster carers who've been fostering for 40 years and are 73 and still going strong. And for those who have young children and foster alongside them, we didn't start until our children have grown up. But I mean, I think we have to face up to the fact that there is a crisis in foster care, and that word is used almost too quickly and flippantly. And it's that perfect combination of more children coming into care, more foster carers resigning than are being recruited. And, inevitably you have that situation. And I think the problem is when you have that sort of crisis, you get nervous about making the right decisions. So, for example, whilst I'm fiercely protective of foster carers, we also have to face up to the fact that we need to, if we're going to achieve the respect as professionals, which we talk about a lot, and there's commitments around that, we also have to look at what we need to do better. Do we need to be better trained? Do we need to look at things that we can address? So the problem is when you're so nervous about possibly offending a foster carer because we cannot afford to lose another one, are we then being too frightened to look at the positives and the negatives? So we have to be honest about that. I think that there's a huge amount of evidence out there. We've got the State of the Nation report from Fostering Network. Foster Wiki did a recent survey, with over 2,500 people. So there is some empirical evidence. And the thing that comes out so strongly is lack of support in whatever form that means. That's why Mockingbird, I think, is working well, because it addresses that issue around support. I don't think Mockingbird is necessarily the answer. We have to look at the principle of what does support mean in different ways. So for some foster carers, it might mean their mental health struggle because it's a tough thing to do, so have we got the right support? And if not, guess what, more foster carers will resign because they can't cope anymore. So if it's a complicated situation, but if you wanted to look at the one word out of any, it's support that's needed for foster carers.
Thank you for that. We're going to go for a short break, and Terry, when we come back, I'm going to ask you to your view. But I think if you're listening to this, it's perhaps an opportunity for you to consider whether or not you've got room in your home and your heart for a young person who, through no fault of their own, has been taken away from their parents. And that we'll talk later on about how you can get involved, certainly in terms of the UK. But if you're in the US or anywhere else in the world, the issues are no different in the Western world as far from for most countries. So please do think about how you can help, whether that's in terms of fostering or whether or not there are opportunities for you to help in a lesser way, but just as important. So don't go away. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back. We're talking about foster caring and the need for young people to have a really stable opportunity when they've been taken away from their parents. Terry, I'm very interested in your view of the state of foster care and your experiences.
Like Sophie was saying, I think things have come forward quite a lot, a real lot. You know, I was left in the early 90s, but fortunately I've stayed right in touch in the care system. Like I went off and had a bit of a business career and then came back, and now I kind of run a housing association. So I'm really in touch and in tune with what's going on right now. Unfortunately for me and my family, the changes have kind of came too late. So my sister, for instance, she exited the care system and just went over that cliff, and ended up having children who then got taken into care, and eventually she was murdered by her boyfriend.
Oh my.
And my brother, very similar story for him. He kind of came out of care, had children, they went into care, and he literally died a few months ago. Now, the thing for me is care experienced people are 70% more likely to die prematurely than any other group, which is really why I'm going at this protected characteristics campaign to the extent that I've been involved in it. Because as you just mentioned earlier, Gina, it is about this community. It's about this aspiration for our care experienced people. And the big problem right now is that care experience, children in care have this scaffolding around them until they're 18. And then once they're 18, they're just kind of dumped into a society which isn't designed for them. Like care experienced people are butting up against a system that's not designed for them. And quite often that's because people are not aware of who we are and what we've actually been through. Because, like, you know, when my sister was murdered and it was in the papers, there was no mention that she was care experienced. It was all about domestic violence. So what I'm saying is that in all these statistics of prison, domestic violence, crime, you're going to find that care experienced people are absolutely disproportionately represented in all those figures. And with the Equality Act, if we managed to get it as a protected characteristic, then there'd be a legal duty to actually look at those figures and determine who is in those figures, such as what care experienced people are in those figures. And then the organisations that are dealing with those issues, then they'll actually see the truth. They'll actually see that if they work together with the other agencies for the benefit of the most vulnerable, then we'll get a better system for all. But on the topic of fostering and protected characteristics, I think it has a massive potential, because what a lot of people don't realise is that people can be protected under the Equality Act by association. So, for instance, if there was a protected characteristic for care experienced people, then there'd be lots of benefits for foster carers in the workplace to be able to, to be able to encourage more foster carers. They wouldn't be able to get discriminated for, like, going off to have a meeting in if they have to leave work. So there's a lot to go, but there's a lot of excitement about the changes, especially around technology as well, and how we actually learn to connect the dots between the different agencies, because that's been historically the biggest issue of everybody in their own little silos.
There's a lot in what you say, and I'm just going to try and unpack a few bits of that. And I do recognise that in an hour-long conversation, we are just scratching the surface. And I think it's really important to say that. And I'm really sorry that your family has been through such incredibly challenging times. And that's pretty much an understatement. One of the things that struck me since I've been working with Fatima's UK campaign is how there's some amazing work going on, but it's very isolated. And as you say, the organisations involved work in silos. And so the joined up thinking that could make such a difference is not there. But the other thing that has struck me is the will to make the difference and to make that on a grand scale. And my sense check, and as I say, I'm a very much, apart from the fact that I was a head teacher and I had dealings with all of the agencies because of the children who were being looked after within my own school over the 20 years I was there, I absolutely recognize that you are the experts and I am the newcomer trying to make sense of a system which seems to have so many things that make no sense at all. And I recognize that money is important, but I think this is about something more than money. I think that the danger is that the public focus on the money, and in doing so, they neglect to really take on board that we are, as a society, responsible for those very vulnerable people who can't help themselves, who have no voice, and that this business of 18, you are on your own, expected to be independent, when actually you're probably the least equipped to do that, that I believe is a disgrace. And I'm just interested, first of all, on your take in terms of, if I had a magic wand and I could wave it, what's the one highest priority that would you think make a difference? And I do accept that this is a very much just a drop in the ocean. But what do you think would be the most significant difference? Terry, I've got a sense of, I know which it's going to be for you. Let's assume that characteristics have been accepted. What else would you go for?
For me, it's utilizing technology so that everybody can see their part in the system and they can connect the dots. Because that's the bit that is missing right now, and it's the bit that I'm most excited about. Because as we over the next 5 to 10 years, with the advent of artificial intelligence and learning models, we're really going to make headway in showing how things actually work, and then people will realize that there is enough money there. It's just not spent in the right places. That's the problem at the moment. So that's the biggest. Obviously, the protected characteristics is just the first part. It's not the, for me internally, it's the holy grail, because that's the thing that kicks everything else off. But there's a lot of other stuff that needs to happen on top of protected characteristics. But what protected characteristics does is it provides and creates the mechanism for this systemic change, and then it's about us making sure that it actually happens.
Okay, thank you. Sophie, what about you?
You spoke about sort of care experienced people, particularly under 18, as voiceless. I just want to really cement the fact that they're not voiceless. And in fact, care experienced people are some of the most eloquent beyond their years. We hear this quite a lot when we talk about vulnerable groups. And as a judge, I think it's really important, like, we're not voiceless, we're just not often given the platform. And I think if young people are brought into these rooms, whether it be the creation of legislation or the media, like anything like that, they do have things to say, and they have really important things that can change policy and can change stigma and can change. And that's why I became a journalist, because I didn't see our community represented. The main reason, I can actually tell you a very short story of how I became a journalist, was I was in the music business, and then during COVID, music obviously shut down. The government brought in the statutory instrument for I'm not going to say it because I think I've forgotten it by now. But they brought in the statutory instrument that was basically like, foster carers don't need to see the kids at a certain period during COVID. And I was like, this is really bad. And I got in touch with Article 39, who were taking the Department of Education for court over this. And I said, what can I do? Like, I'll do anything. I'll go through Ofsted reports. Like, I'll do anything you want. I'm on rotational furlough. And so I helped them gather evidence for this campaign to get it reversed, because about 5,000 kids in care go missing every year. And as I was doing that, I was explaining to my friends what was going on in government and breaking it down into the most sort of easily digestible, accessible sort of writing. And I realized what I was doing in that moment was journalism. And so I decided to apply for journalism school, and the rest is history. But I've recently I'm not going to go into the toolkit right now, but yeah, that is why I became a journalist. And I think it's really important to have voices like mine and so many other care experienced people involved at these levels, again, whether it be politics, media, other things, because we do have things to say. We have informative things to say, because as you say, like, we are the experts. And I do think sometimes professionals forget that.
Thank you very much for correcting me, because actually what I had meant was they have no platform. And certainly in my very limited experience, what youngsters have to say, and those who have left care, is so powerful, but often not given the opportunity to be aired. And I think one of the challenges for people like me who provide a platform for people to share their voice is how challenging it is to, particularly for those who are within the care system, is to give them a voice because of the concern around safeguarding and so on. And I'm not sure whether there are opportunities that could be created in a more systemic way, but I think we need to look for that. So thank you very much for that. So we've got a couple of minutes before the break, and I don't really want to foreshorten any contribution that any of you've got. So I'm going to ask Sarah, you've got a few minutes before the break, but if you have more to say, very happy to carry on after the break. What would make the fundamental differences for you if you had a magic wand?
I think actually, for me, this is about societal awareness. And I would probably refer back to Sophia, actually. I think it's the perfect time to talk about your toolkit, because in order to get societal awareness, you need to give people platforms and you need to ask them questions. But when it comes to care experience, it's really important that that is done with, as you've just said, Gina, there's safeguarding and there's well-being. There's really important approaches that you need to think about in relation to asking people to tell their story, which, Terry's just told you some of his. These are the reality. These are people's lives that can be extremely traumatic, and there'll be different points in times when people are ready to tell their story or to talk about it. And the work that Sophia's done, that's what I would refer to, really, because I think that if society were more aware, then we would have the potential to have more interest and care about how we take this forward, because you need as many people as possible to know about these issues in order for them to be involved in part of the solutions. That's how we change society, is raising awareness. So I think it would be really useful. I don't know if now or after the break, for Sophia to talk about her toolkit.
I really don't want to foreshorten that conversation, because it's obviously so important. But we've got a couple more minutes, Sarah. So you've got the toolkit. Is there anything else that you'd like to change?
I think I would really like us to see a focus on prevention. So there are things so I've been a social worker now for over 20 years, and there are very different situations in social care to what it was when I first started practicing. So, for just in a nutshell, social work is very well protected. There was a good, strong workforce of social workers with experienced individuals supervising you and supporting you. You were not expected to make critical life impacting decisions on day 1 or 2. You had a number of years, and I had some fantastic line managers who taught me incredibly well and ensured that I was doing the right things for children. It was very child-centered practice. And one of the things I worry about now is the level of skills and experience and enough. We don't have enough social workers in order to resource that part of the sector well enough. So I think we need to do things like caseload caps for social workers, because unfortunately there's no other protection there right now. So I think we need to legislate caps for social workers so that they can give the right amount of time and energy to each child and family that they're working with. And I also think we need to stop pretending that social care is a 9 to 5. So in every other part of the sector, people work shifts. We acknowledge that children and families need us outside of 9 to 5. And I think we really need to be moving towards that place with social work and creating a shift pattern, so that instead of expecting social workers to just work very, very long hours, which is currently the case, that we actually say, no, this role is similar to nursing. Health doesn't switch off, and social care can't switch off either. So we need to create improved conditions so that we can attract more people to become social workers, because it's a very valuable job and you can really, achieve huge things, but you have to think about it in a way that still creates a work-life balance and a role that's got some standards and security around it as well.
Thank you. I think that's so important, particularly as society is quick to criticise without understanding the pressures that everybody is under. And sadly, people will fall through the net, both in terms of workers and those they're supporting, if it's not properly resourced. We're going to go for a short break. When we come back, I'm going to ask Geoff of his magic wand suggestions, and then we're going to go into the toolkit. So please don't go away. Welcome back. So Geoff, you've got the magic wand. What are the things that you would do to make a positive difference?
I think probably what I want to do is magic away all the disparate voices, all of whom have got their own magic wand, and convert it into one magic wand. Because the big problem in our sector, and you can look back over the last 10, 20 years, the more you dig into it, we've been saying the same things over and over again, and nothing changes. And until we get some sort of more unified approach, there are so many different voices, all of whom are hugely respected in their own ways. But you look at the silly scraps on social media, and the individual agendas. We need to get all the key players together and have a more unified approach. And remember that the only agenda that matters is the agenda of the children that we're seeking to support, love and care for. And until we get some more unification, we will talk and go around lots of different people and not get anywhere. I think there are some steps towards that. I'm not suggesting the Fostering Advisory Board is the answer to all problems, but at least it is there. And sometimes we do have to be thankful for small mercies. But I think as a general principle, that's my biggest frustration, when you struggle to really see the picture. And if you were in government, you'd be looking, thinking, what on earth do we do here some of the time? Yes, of course, there was the independent review, but even that is not totally clear in terms of all of the solutions. The one thing I do agree is they came up with a very good conclusion that money is important. And whilst I take your point, Gina, I think it would have been good rather than 200 odd grand instead of the 2.3 billion, even a billion would have been nice, and I think would have made some impact. So I've done a bit of wand waving there, I think.
Well, the drop in the ocean that they are offering, what strikes me is if you invest in prevention and providing the right sort of support at the front end, it wouldn't cost you so much financially, socially, emotionally, individually at the other end. But sadly, getting the powers that be to see that is something that's really very difficult. But thank you very much for your contribution. And I couldn't agree with you more. And that's one of the reasons why we've got the summit that's planned for next year, is to bring all of these different groups together. So thank you very much. Sophia, the toolkit, you have the stage. Can you please explain it to us?
Yeah, of course. So for the last 3 years, I've been working on a media toolkit for journalists and care experienced people. So when I first became a journalist, I had a lot of my friends who were care experienced come to me, and it wasn't, give them an opportunity to write an opinion piece. It was with complaints. It was complaints about how they'd experienced a interaction with a journalist. It was, they'd had a really hard interview with a journalist, and then at 2 a.m. the night afterwards, they're up all night thinking, oh my God, what have I said to this person? It's journalists spelling names wrong, getting the type of care they were in, like residential care instead of kinship or something. It was the way some journalists were looking for just that horrific sort of headline grabbing story. Poverty porn is what I essentially refer to it as. I gave as much advice as I could. At the end of the day, I was a new journo, parroted what I'd learned in my media law classes, and talked to them about how I'd also experienced the same thing. Before I was ever a journalist, I was an interviewee, and I think that really informs my practice as a trauma-informed journalist. I realised I need to create some sort of guide so that if I'm not around at 2 a.m. on Instagram Messenger, they can still get advice. And for people who don't know me, they can still get advice. So I spoke to friends in the media, and they said that a toolkit is kind of the language used around this sort of project, I thought, okay, I'll develop a toolkit for care experienced people. And as I was creating these resources, like advice for what to do before the interview, during the interview, after the interview, I realized, why is all the onus on my community? The onus should also be on journalists to make sure they're not going in and accidentally triggering an interviewee. I need to make a toolkit for both journalists and care experienced people. I work a full-time job. I volunteer in like every spare time I have, and I play the saxophone. So I didn't have a lot of time to dedicate to this project. But 2 years ago now, I applied for something called the Churchill Fellowship. The Churchill Fellowship will send you anywhere in the world to research whatever you want, as long as you have sort of a good idea. And I applied to go visit the States, and I got it. And so in January this year, I spent a month traveling around New York, Boston, and Los Angeles. And I interviewed over 50 journalists, care experienced people, foster carers, adoption agencies, psychiatrists, child psychologists, like everyone I could think of, because I didn't want it to just be sort of called trauma informed. I wanted it to actually be rooted in trauma and professionals of that. And so this all concluded with the publication of my toolkit at the start of this month. It's free to access if you type in Media Toolkit for journalists and care experienced people. It's hosted on the Churchill Fellowship's website and a couple of other charities. I think the Fostering Network have a link to it as well. So if you're on their website, I'm sure you can find it. And it's essentially help for both foster, like children who are in care / who are care experienced, as well as journalists. It's 36 pages long, so as concise as can possibly be. The first half is dedicated to journalists, the second half is dedicated to care experienced people. And it's something, for example, care experienced people can look at before they decide that they want to tell their story in the media. There's a checklist, am I ready to tell my story? Am I comfortable with everything I say being accessible on the internet for the next 50 years? Various things to ask yourself depending on the format of the interview. And then also for journalists, it's an introduction to the care system, ways of asking questions and giving back power to what I've called a disempowered interviewee. So, someone who has experienced choices being made without their input. So, for example, a disempowered interviewee could be someone who wasn't told what foster care home they were being sent to next. They had their choice taken away. So in the interview, I tell the journalist, is there any way you can give that choice back? Can you show them the piece before it's published? Can you offer them where to sit? Can you say, oh, why don't you choose the headline for this piece? Giving back sort of various things. But the toolkit is also for social workers and foster carers and anyone who might be supporting a care experienced, either young person or older person or just a friend who might like to tell their story. And so yeah, it's been 3 years of work, and I'm so excited it's out there in the world. It's already in the hands of like Channel 4, the BBC, a lot of big publications, obviously The Big Issue, where I work, and I've had some lovely messages from friends so far. One of them even told me they refused to do an interview until the journalist read the toolkit. So I think it's having an effect, and I'm really glad it is. It felt like something I could do, but I wanted to make sure I did it in the right way. I didn't just want to create something completely from my experience, which is why I wanted to interview all these 50+ people to get as much input as possible. And I really, really hope it helps.
I'm sure it will, and I hope it gets lots and lots of exposure, because whether you're care experienced or not, being interviewed by the media can not always work out as you think it's going to. So perhaps it's got a broader audience than those who are looked after.
Definitely does.
One of the things that I have been made aware of, in fact, it was a conversation with you last week, Sarah, is that if you are a childminder, or you have various other roles in terms of looking after people, there is a national register that you have to renew every year. But I was really surprised to discover that foster carers don't have anything like that. Do you want to just talk us through that as an issue?
Yeah. So there's social care registers in each of the countries, and there's also an inspectorate process that sits around lots of parts of the system where care is provided to children or vulnerable people. So for example, if you work in residential care, or if you are a social worker, you have to register and you have to re-register, and you have to evidence that you've maintained professional development and met certain requirements in order to maintain your registration as a social worker or as a residential care worker or as a childminder, lots of different parts. So but there's a big gap in relation to foster carers because there is no register. So there is no central place for foster carers to either be on or maintain that registration and status as a foster carer. So that's all done at local level, which means that there isn't really a UK-wide transparency around that. And there also isn't the same level of status and expectation, like Geoff mentioned earlier, in relation to professional development and those requirements that we have around other parts of the workforce and not the same around foster caring. So I think there's pros and cons. There's lots of reasons why some people might think that would be of benefit. There's other reasons why it might not. You have to make sure that you remember that fostering is first and foremost parenting. It's creating a family environment for children. So, is that different to social workers? Absolutely. Is it different to residential care workers? Yes, in some ways. But should we remove any level of status and standards and requirements? I'm not sure. So, there's lots of discussion around this. One of the key things for me is a safeguarding piece, because if somebody comes forward to be a childminder, you can check whether they have been a childminder before. There is a centralised process for that. And the same for other parts of the sector. If someone comes forward to foster, because of the number of different ways and organisations and the number of independent organisations and local authorities, if somebody doesn't disclose that they were a foster carer before, they could become one again, and there may be reasons why they shouldn't be. So for me, it's a real safeguarding loophole for children and young people, and that's why I feel quite strongly that we really need to think about this. The governments of the UK need to think about what have we done to ensure that this safeguarding loophole is no longer there. What do we do to make sure that children and young people are protected when we place them in foster care?
Thank you for that. We're going to go for our final break, but please don't go away because there's still a lot more to come. See you in a minute. Welcome back. Geoff, what do you think are the characteristics of a good foster carer?
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting one. You need so many different characteristics. There's no doubt about that. Do you know, if I was probably putting the one at the top, I'd probably go for empathy. In actual fact, which isn't always top of the list. And we talk about resilience, which you absolutely need, determination, commitment, and so on. But I think, and it almost gets back to the subject of it's not your fault, which intrigues me, because this is something that comes up so many times. And one of the biggest, it's great to say as a foster carer, well, yeah, of course I get that. I absolutely understand that we need to empathise and we need to accept the fact that the trauma that every single one of these children would have suffered in some shape or form will affect their behaviour. But when you're in the middle of a football match with a looked after child who has seen his brother being kicked hard by another person, and then he protects his brother because that's what he's done in his life, and there's fists flying everywhere and incredible language, for you to say as a foster carer, well, it's not your fault, I love you and want to care for you, is quite challenging, so we have to understand the practicality of it. But I think if you've got that as your sort of roots, your core informed situation, because it isn't often the birth parents' fault. There's so many people that it's not their fault. So I think it's a huge subject, and it's one we need to really get to grips with as foster carers. I could list a whole load of other characteristics that you need that are probably quite obvious, really, but I think that's the one I'd focus on.
I think it's an interesting concept, isn't it? It's not your fault. And if I broaden it out, for example, to young people where parents have split up, they will often have a sense that it's my fault. If only I'd been better, if only I'd been good. And if you then add that, the broader dimension of youngsters being taken into care, I can only imagine how big a emotional load that is for them, where they are.
Yeah, well, you're talking about you're getting into issues around shame as well, and I was really interested in what's almost a dilemma between that Sophia was talking about, where there's a big issue around stigma. Yeah. And of course, what Terry's looking at, which is absolutely, I'm a firm supporter of protected characteristics, but it cannot necessarily come without the danger of stigma. So, if we're looking at Mockingbird at our sort of grassroots level, there are some children in a family who do not want to participate in the social activities we have. They don't want it because they don't want it. They just want to be inverted commas normal. They don't want to, and we respect that. You absolutely have to have an individual approach. But I think it's an interesting quandary dilemma in terms of, yes, we need to be protected, but we don't need to stigmatize. It's quite an interesting one.
And Terry, what's your view of that? Because it's it is a challenge, isn't it, for children to want to feel normal. And I think for most children, in my experience, that's the thing. They want to belong. They want to fit in. They don't want to be seen as something outside the everyday group.
Yeah, for me, it's a bit of an oxymoron because the Equality Act was created to reduce and eliminate stigma. So that's the first point. The second point is it's a personal choice whether to basically disclose the fact your care experience, and it'll always be your choice. Some people choose to disclose that and some people don't. But the third and biggest point is really this is about changing the system around care experienced people so that it's not noticeable. So if you take somebody with disabilities who approaches a zebra crossing, if they're in a wheelchair, then there'll be a dipped curb and they'll be able to cross that road without waving a flag to say, I'm in a wheelchair. The system will be just designed for them to do that and nobody will notice around them. You know, if they're hard of hearing, they'll see the zebra crossing flash. You know, if they can't see, they'll hear it. And that's really what we need for the care system, that it's not noticeable, that basically we have equitable equality of access to services. And I think when we get that, then we will have a real systemic change within the care system.
Thank you. Any response from any of you others would like to make? No.
I think just hearing the words like "it's not your fault" made me quite emotional, because I remember telling myself that like a lot and never believing it when I was in the system, and sort of hearing Geoff speak was really quite emotional. I actually went back to not my graduation, but kind of a fake graduation. I went to Oxford and they have this thing called an MA confer. And basically I had such a sad first graduation. You know, I invited my social worker who didn't turn up and I've always wanted to redo it. And so I went back this weekend. And I think from my perspective, what would make a good foster parent is kind of being there for the big moments. I never really had a long-term foster parent who's still in my life, but I have a partner now. And I've never heard the words "I'm proud of you" as much as I did on Saturday. And it really meant a lot. And I really wanted to share that because I think it's important. I think a lot of people who leave the care system and do go on to do something like university or something else where there's a celebration, a lot of us don't have anyone to celebrate with. And I think that's what makes a good foster parent. Yeah, just being there, just being the person who can tell a young person, you know, "I'm proud of you." I think that's what's missing from the care system more than anything.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, that's so powerful. And if I can just come back on that, because actually it's one of the privileges of being a foster carer that we get to share those moments, really, that the birth parents have a right to in a lot of ways. But yeah, I mean, even yesterday, you know, I was lucky enough to have found a football team for one of the children, Mockingbird Constellation, who's with a foster carer who doesn't know about football. So this is where, again, Mockingbird works. And, you know, he's played in his first football match and there's a look on his face. And, you know, my first thing is, "I'm proud of you." You know, and it is emotional. There's nothing wrong with being emotional about that. But I cannot explain what a privilege that is for foster carers. And any foster carer will understand that. Any foster carer that has had the opportunity to, you know, to love a child. And I'm not afraid to use the word love, because that is what it is.
I think we've all got to stop being afraid to use the word love, because ultimately that's what we all need, is to feel that we're loved. I have to say that if you're listening to this, there's not a dry eye in the house. Sophia, we're all, I think, want you to know just what a brilliant job you've done, and how I've only met you today, but I'm incredibly proud of what you've achieved, and I hope that you'll take that on board and take that forward. We've got very few minutes left in the show. What can people do if they've listened to this and they want to get involved? Where would you send them? What would you do? I'm going to go around to each of you, and what preparation can they make? Let's start with you, Terry.
Ooh, I just think it's about awareness of what our young people are going through. You know, I remember talking to a chief executive of a council, and I was explaining, basically I was there in the room to try and get them to do the council tax exemption, and they was doing it, but they was doing it only for the kids that are from their area, and I was trying to make it so that they could do it for kids from outside the area, because there's a lot of people that get sent further away. But all of a sudden he just started staring into space, and it got a bit uncomfortable, and I was trying to understand what was actually going on, and he was reflecting about his own child leaving, if his own child was in the same position. And really, I think for me, it's just reflect, if it was your child that had to leave the care system and have no support and all that scaffolding go away, how would you feel? You know, I think that's the biggest thing for me. And from that, people are human, and they are passionate, and they do have a heart, and from that we will get that love into the system.
Thank you. Sarah.
Well, I would echo what Terry just said about if this were my child. So quite a long time ago, there was a piece of policy work done which was shared with all councillors and leaders in Wales. It was a piece of work in Wales, and it was to inform people that when you think about care experience population in your local authority, you should make every decision as if they were your child. And it was a really powerful piece of policy that no longer seems to be talked about or exists really, but it's something that I talk about a lot in our organisation, and with every interaction I have, is that is what we should be thinking when we're making decisions. And I would also add, if you can do that, if you can think about other children as if they were your own, then you should also think about finding out about fostering. And it would be remiss of me not to take the opportunity to say that if you are out there listening to this and you think that you could provide love, warmth, stability and empathy to a child who needs it, then you really should take that next step. And that might just be asking the questions that you're a bit too worried to ask, because we deliver helplines across the UK and anybody can contact them. You can go to our website, theFosterNetwork.org.uk, and pick up the phone and just ask those questions, find out about what you need or what you might need to explore, what you might need to learn, how you might go about it, because there are more people out there, I believe, that could become foster carers, and ultimately the best way to improve our outcomes and experiences for children and young people is to have more foster carers, so we have better choice, better options and better provision for them to be able to live where they need to, when they need that family, and how they need it to work for them.
Thank you very much. And if you're listening to this and you're not in the UK, Google it. The internet's a great starting point, and just ask the question, how do I find out about foster caring in my area? Very briefly, because we're running out of time, Sophia, what would you like to say?
Treat everyone like they might be care experienced. As Terry said earlier, you know, not everyone wants to disclose it. And something I found as someone who felt like I was the only foster kid in the entire world growing up is, since becoming a sort of public facing care experience person, is the amount of people who have disclosed it to me. So I don't want to hear any of these stereotypes. I don't want people talking about these bad kids in foster care. You never know who you're sitting next to. You never know what they've been through. Just treat everyone with kindness. I know it's an absolute basic, but I think it's worth reiterating.
It's an absolute basic, but it's not happening. And so if everybody did that, what a different world we'd live in. And last word to you, Geoff.
I think listening to the emotion that's flowed out of this, which I don't think maybe any of us were expecting out of this panel, I feel sort of like a renewed vigor, really, to separate the emotional. You know, we have to do the boring stuff. We have to change the system. We have to do all of that. But it doesn't do any harm sometimes to remember what this is all about. Despite all the huge problems, and there are massive problems with foster carers who can't feel able to say things to the local authority for fear of deregistration and so on, but we still have to be advocates right now, right here, because that's what's needed. So do both, but at the same time, let's be passionate about the positives whilst dealing with all the negatives that we need to sort out as well.
That's a great way to finish. I just want to say thank you all very much for being involved. It's been a huge privilege to talk to you today. It just remains for me to say thank you very much for joining me on today's show. I'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to contact me, you can do that either through the website, which is brushwoodmedianetwork.com, or you can email me at ginagardnerandfriends@gmail.com. See you on the next show. Bye-bye.